So we're going to get started here, and I'm going to email these to Ben when we're done, but I'm also going to show you where you can find them on my website as well. So let's get started here. Here's how to get a hold of me. Don't go to the bio, it's just a pack of lies like everybody else's, but this does have my contact information on it. I've been doing these trainings in various formats for since May a year ago, and they've morphed over time as things have changed. There are a lot of resources on the internet to help you out with folks. Some of them are geared for lawyers, others are geared for tenants and landlords. My Housing Law in Minnesota website is where I will put this slideshow when I'm done. I'll just go over to that for a second. It's on a website called povertylaw.homestead.com, but if you were to Google my name and poverty law or housing law, you'd probably find this website pretty quickly. And the way you get to things is you just go to, it's a teaching website that I use for courses that I teach in law schools. But if you just came to the home page here and wanted to find your way around, you just go to housing law. And a lot of what I've been doing has been talking about pandemic eviction rules. And the new law that we're going to be discussing tonight is this very first link up here. But I'll post this up here as well. So if you want to get back to it, you can find it there, because I do have some links that are activated in this. And so if you had it up in your computer and you clicked on these links, it would take you to these sites. Homeline has a very good page on different types of information related to tenants, and so does Law Help. And I should put a link up here to Housing Justice Center as well, and that's where Max and Bridget are from. And they've got a lot of good information as well as the Minnesota Law Library. So what I'm going to talk briefly about is kind of the new kind of reality that we have for evictions. It's all based on a law that was passed on June 29th. I was one of the lobbyists on that law. I didn't get everything that I wanted, but it definitely got more than I think the Republican Senate was proposing back in the early part of the spring. What it did is it ended the executive orders that the governor had issued and replaced them with an eviction moratorium phase out that started on June 30th. So let's talk about what immediately went into effect, and then we'll talk about things that go into effect in stages. Immediately and through October 12, any landlord who wants to file an eviction case for non-payment of rent has to give the tenant a notice 15 days before filing that case with this information on it, principally saying that the moratorium has ended, the tenant may be subject to eviction, this is the total of rent due, and assistance is available from Rent Help Minnesota along with the link. And so this is the type of notice that needs to be given for any type of non-payment of rent case until October 12, 2021. Some other things that happened right away is that landlords could terminate or not renew leases in certain conditions. And I want to take a moment to explain the difference between a lease termination and an eviction, because a lot of times these words are used somewhat interchangeably and they have different legal meanings. So a lease termination or non-renewal is the landlord or the tenant saying to one or the other, I want the tenancy to end, okay? And so maybe the landlord's saying it to the tenant because the landlord thinks the tenant breached the lease. Maybe the tenant is saying it because it's the end of the lease and the tenant doesn't want to continue any longer, or the landlord doesn't want to continue any longer. Now, a landlord can't forcibly remove a tenant from the property. So if the landlord wants the tenant to move and the tenant doesn't move, the landlord has to file an eviction case. So the eviction is actually the court case. It's not the tenant leaving because the landlord said leave. That's simply the landlord saying what the landlord wants the tenant to do. So the eviction is the court case that the landlord files if the tenant doesn't move. And the eviction is what happens if the landlord wins the case and has the sheriff come out to remove the tenant. So those are the stages of that process. So we're going to talk a little bit about different times when lease terminations open up more and different times when eviction court cases open up more. So what's available right now for lease termination or non-renewal? a number, and some of these categories were in effect under the executive orders, so they're not an expansion. Some of this is an expansion, but some of it isn't. So tenant seriously endangers the safety of others or significantly damages property. That was already under the executive order. Tenant violates a law called 504B.171. What that law says is that both tenants and landlords, so it covers both of them, says that they will not use or possess illegal drugs on the property. They will not engage in prostitution, in different firearms offenses, will not keep stolen property on the property. They will not engage in harassment, domestic abuse, things like that. So if the tenant were to violate any of those things, then the landlord could evict. And just to talk about drugs for a moment, since there are a lot in the news in terms of kind of the decriminalization effort around the country. The bill in the legislature to decriminalize marijuana did not pass. It passed the House of Representatives. It did not pass the Senate. So in Minnesota, possession of even small amounts of marijuana, it's not a crime for which you could go to jail, but it is what's called an offense for which you could be ticketed, and that violates this law. Now, medical marijuana use that's regulated under the state is not an illegal use of marijuana and would not violate this law. One other thing about this law, it's a defense to an eviction case based on it if the tenant didn't know or have reason to know that illegal drugs were on the property. So this would be the situation where maybe mom doesn't know that the 15-year-old kid has marijuana on the property. If that's the case, then the landlord would not win that case against the mom. Okay, so some other categories. Tenant commits a material lease violation. Now, this is an expansion from the executive order. The executive order was really focused on the things that I just mentioned. So this was an expansion. So what's a material lease violation? It's essentially a big violation versus a small violation. A lot of landlords and tenants think that any violation of the lease is grounds for eviction, but it's really only material ones. And so those are the bigger ones. So an idea of how to distinguish them, there isn't like a list of big ones and small ones that you can just look at. It's a very kind of fact specific thing. So one way to explain it would be that if I have a loud party and I'm a tenant, and it's so loud that the police are called and all the other, and let's say I do this regularly and all the other tenants are saying, man, we're going to leave because we can't stand it anymore. That's probably going to be more in the nature of a material lease violation. Now, on the other hand, let's say I have one party and it's a little bit loud. And let's say the lease says no parties after 9 and the party gets done at 9:30. It's a little bit loud. The police are called. They don't think there's any problem there. They don't issue any tickets. The neighbor next door is maybe a little overly sensitive to noise. That probably would not be a material lease violation. So it's kind of the difference between, I think, kind of minor kind of annoyances and big deal things. Okay. Some other things here, the stuff about manufactured home park residence is really pretty similar to what we've just said already. An expansion here is for non-payment of rent, because landlords could not evict for non-payment of rent under the executive orders. But this is a very limited expansion. It's only if the tenant is eligible for state rental assistance and refuses to apply or provide information to the landlord, or refuses to provide proof to the landlord that the tenant applied. Now I know that so you have to have both those categories there. So interestingly enough, if the tenant is ineligible for state financial assistance, the landlord can't terminate at this point. The only termination for non-payment of rent is in this category, which requires that the tenant be eligible for assistance, but essentially refusing to kind of move the process along. We don't have any cases on it yet. I think the operative, you know, as a lawyer, I'm always looking at what are the operative words, right? So like for endangerment, it's serious endangerment. For property damage, it's significant property damage. For here, I think the operative word is refuse. Just because a tenant didn't apply, didn't mean they refused to apply. Just because the tenant didn't respond to the landlord right away, didn't mean the tenant refused to provide information. So I think that's going to be the operative word in this section. And if I were advising landlords who are considering evicting in this category, I would say, let's talk this over a little bit and see if we really think we fit these prongs here. Next one, tenant abandon the property. This is an expansion. I don't think this one's going to be real controversial, but I have had cases in the past where, you know, a landlord has changed the locks on a tenant, and then tenant says, what's going on? The landlord says, well, I think you abandoned the property. And so then the case ends up being about, was that really the case or not? And, you know, if the tenant still has stuff there, I think the landlord would be kind of walking out on the ledge a little bit by saying this is an abandoned property case. There's a difference between a lot of property there and a few gum wrappers. Okay, so that's kind of where we're at for lease termination. Okay, so next I'm going to move on to what's immediately available as of June 30th for eviction court cases. So we just talked about when the landlord could terminate the lease. Now we're talking about when the landlord could file an eviction case. And I do want to note that any eviction cases that were filed before June 30th are still governed by the governor's executive orders. And there's not a lot of time tonight, so I don't want to go into the nuances of that. But if anybody has, if a landlord or a tenant has an eviction case that started before June 30th, what we're talking about right now would not apply to that case. What was in effect, you know, on June 29th would apply, which is kind of different set of rules. Okay, so eviction cases that could be filed as of June 30th. Okay, you can see there's some similarity here. We've got the serious endangerment, we got significant damage, we got violation of 504B171, we got the manufactured home park stuff, we got the non-payment of rent stuff, and we have the abandonment of property. What we don't have here was a material lease violation. Okay. Landlord could terminate for that, but they couldn't file the eviction case yet. So if a landlord filed an eviction case for a material lease violation, but it didn't fit any of the categories on this list, and they did that before they were able to do that, that case may very well get dismissed for that reason. Okay. So a few of the things that happened immediately on June 30th. From manufactured home parks, besides what we already said. When people rent manufactured, okay, for those of you who don't know about manufactured home parks, used to be called mobile home parks, or way back in the day, they were called trailers, which gets us to a great old tune called, I'm gonna space the name of it, it was a Roger Miller tune, King of the Road, talked about trailers for sale or rent. Well, we're talking about manufactured homes, okay? So there are parks where people have manufactured homes. Usually they're renting the lot on which the manufactured home sits. They may own that manufactured home, but they're renting the lot space. And so what we were talking about just a moment ago was when can the park owner evict a park resident from the slot they're renting. Okay, now what we're talking about is we've got that here, but also a lot of people that buy manufactured homes, they get financing for it. And it's kind of like getting financing for buying a car. And so the bank that gave you the loan for it, they own what's called a security interest. And if you don't pay them, it allows them to repossess your car, which gets us to our second great movie, Repo Man, with Emilio Estevez and Harry Dean Stanton. Got to watch that sometime. It's very retro. Most trunks don't have anything nuclear in them, but still it's a pretty good movie. Okay, what this is getting at is that bank can't basically repossess the manufactured home in this time frame until we get to October 12th. Okay. Now, what happened today? Well, actually, something did happen today. and we're talking in sequences of how things evolve over the next year. So what happened today is what opened up for eviction court cases is landlords could now file that case for material lease violation. So as of June 30th, a few slides ago, they could terminate, but they couldn't file the eviction case. As of today, they can file that eviction case. So that's what's added to the list. That's why I have it on italics and bold up there. Now, I think what's going to happen is we're going to see an uptick in cases. I think we're going to see it both for some landlords saying non-payment of rent, if we fit these categories here, eligible for assistance and kind of refusing to play ball. And then also material lease violations. I think some landlords will legitimately do a material lease violation case for that nasty loud party I talked about. But there are others that are going to kind of see this as an opening. They're going to see, well, I got this person for non-payment of rent, but they don't fit this category here and they haven't paid for a while and I want them to go. So I think I'm going to make kind of a mountain out of this little molehill of a small violation into a material lease violation. And it's going to be up to judges and juries that hear those cases to figure out, was this really a material lease violation? So that's what changed today. But we've got other changes kind of coming down the pike. So on August 13, the new category for termination or non-renewal will be if the tenant owes rent and is ineligible for state emergency rental assistance. Okay, so right now it's only if they're eligible and they're not playing ball. If they're ineligible, they can't be terminated until we get to August 13. Now, the law doesn't say who makes that determination of ineligibility. Now, a landlord could perhaps go to the Rent Help Minnesota website and make a determination that the tenant's not eligible, maybe because their income is really high, and decides to terminate that lease. If I were advising a landlord, I'd want them to be kind of careful in making that determination. Now, the state will make determinations on applications for state rental assistance, and there have been some denials of assistance up to this point. It's been more that the tenants had trouble kind of supplying the correct information. I don't think there have been a lot of denials for basically having incomes too high, but that's when that will open up. And Max and Bridget will talk a little bit about the process and how people find out when they're eligible and when they're not eligible and how long the process might take and that type of thing. Okay, so the next stage is September 12th. And what opens up there is in the eviction court case world. That opens up the case where the landlord's saying the tenant owes me rent and they're ineligible for assistance. So a month earlier, they could terminate that lease and say to the tenant, I want you to move, but they couldn't file that case until September 12. Now, the other thing they will have to have done, as I mentioned a few slides earlier, is give that 15-day notice for any non-payment of rent case they're filing. So that's what gets added to the list at that point. Now, the big opening happens on October 12th. Essentially, almost everything is opened up there with the exception of one thing. And that one thing is that the landlord can't terminate or not renewal or evict if the reason is the tenant owes rent and the tenant has a pending application for state rental assistance. And that kind of safe harbor for tenants goes until June 1 of 2022. But I want to be clear about what I just said, okay? This protection only happens if the landlord is taking their action for non-payment of rent. So like, let's say I've got a pending application, okay? The landlord can't evict me for non-payment of rent, but I have illegal drugs in the property. Okay, well, they could evict me for that. You know, if they can prove it up and I don't have any defenses to it, or that I'm seriously endangering others, or I'm significantly damaging the property. So tenants need to know that this protects them for eviction for non-payment of rent, but not for other reasons that fit the law. Okay, and so it's certainly not that many people would do this, but it's not a license to kind of act with reckless abandon once you have a pending rental assistance application. But what opens up here is, let's say, the landlord wants to not renew my lease because they want to rent to somebody else. Okay. Now, right now, they can't do that. Okay. They can only do that if we got a material lease violation, or those different things I talked about earlier. But on October 12th, most of this goes back to the way things were before the pandemic, with the safe harbor exception. So if the landlord wants to rent to somebody else, and that's their reason for not renewing the lease, they would be able to do that. Okay. So that's how things gradually open up. So one of the things I want to say about this process is you can see that there are various grounds that landlords have to evict tenants, and they open up gradually over time. But something landlords need to think about it, and Max and Bridget will talk about kind of how the Rent Help Minnesota program works. But one thing landlords need to know is if they evict a tenant and the tenant hasn't gotten their assistance yet, and now the tenant is a farmer tenant who doesn't live on the property anymore, the tenant's not going to get the assistance, because the assistance is to keep the tenant in the property, which means landlord, you're not going to get that money. And so if I were advising a landlord who had maybe a potential material lease violation case against a tenant, I'd have a little chat about, well, how badly do you want the property back? How badly you want this person to leave? How badly do you want the property back? And how important is it for you to get the money from the Rent Help Minnesota program? How do you weigh those? And if the latter is more important, then maybe you don't file that case for material lease violation. Maybe have a conversation with the tenant about how can we kind of coexist here so you're complying with my lease, and so have that kind of conversation. Okay, so a couple of the things I just want to go through very quickly. There are more slides here, but I'm just going to go through these quickly because I want to move on to talking about Rent Help Minnesota. There's a law called the CARES Act, and what that act adds to the mix is that if a tenant is in a covered property, the landlord has to give a 30-day notice before they can file any kind of eviction case. So that layers on to what we've already discussed earlier. And so what's a covered property? Well, covered property are, essentially subsidized housing programs and public housing programs, but also properties that have federally backed mortgages. Okay. And there's a whole alphabet soup of subsidized public housing properties. And there's a way to find out if you're not sure if your property is subsidized. Generally, people that own subsidized properties or rent them are going to know that. The harder thing here is whether the property is a federally backed mortgage. A lot of people don't know that because mortgages get bought and sold and they get sent around. So there are some websites where landlords and tenants can figure out if they're in that type of property. Okay. A lot of people have heard about a CDC ban on evictions, non-payment of rent evictions. That expires July 31, but because of the laws that we have in Minnesota, it really doesn't have any impact here. It doesn't kind of change kind of the equation that we have here. So I would just kind of ignore what you hear about that. There are some court orders talking about how evictions are opening up here. Essentially, what they've been doing so far is if they're telling landlords, make sure you're giving the notices. We want to know that you're giving the notices that you're supposed to give, including that CARES Act notice. So want landlords to say, are you in a covered property, and have you given the right kind of notice? Okay. Financial assistance. Max and Bridget are going to talk about that, so I'm just going to kind of scoot past that. There are other types of financial assistance programs like emergency assistance. And those are going to be helpful for tenants that have to move. Because for the financial assistance, Rent Help Minnesota and the like, that's to keep tenants where they are. Now, if a tenant has to move, a county emergency assistance may be available to help maybe pay a deposit and a first month's rent on a new place. For tenants that are looking for housing, Housing Link is a great resource out there, both by calling or going to the websites. There are mediation programs all around the state of Minnesota, and you can get to the one that's nearest you by going to communitymediationmn.org. There are a lot of legal aid programs out there. So like in St. Paul, Ramsey County, it's Southern Minnesota Regional Legal Services and Volunteer Lawyers Network are out there. There also are online advice programs and tenant advice from Homeline. There's also tenant organizing available at Homeline and United Renters for Justice. There also are housing advocacy and litigation programs, including where Max and Bridget work, the Housing Justice Center, where I work at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. And lastly, I've got some links here. If you have opinions on how things are going, good or bad, raise your voice. Talk to your representative, talk to the governor, to the attorney general, county commissioners, mayors, city council, the court system, and federally as well. So now I'm going to stop sharing here, but I'm going to stick around.
Thank you so much, Larry. I'm going to pass it over to Max and Bridget. I'm going to introduce them though for a moment. Max Sy is a housing stability attorney at the Housing Justice Center. He joined the Housing Justice Center after graduating from the University of Minnesota. He's particularly interested in public interest law and worked as a law clerk at Mid-Minnesota Legal Aid prior to working at the Housing Justice Center. Bridget Kelly is a JD candidate at the University of Minnesota. Prior to coming to Minnesota, she served as the Associate Director of Community Engagement and Public Policy at People Assisting the Homeless. So Max and Bridget, thank you so much for coming and presenting tonight.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Ben, and thank you so much to the library for having us. So as Ben said, Bridget and I, and also we have Meg on the call today. The three of us work at the Housing Justice Center. I will go ahead and share my, oh, sorry, Ben, is that okay if I can get screen sharing? And we have a little PowerPoint to share as well.
Yep, just 1 second.
Perfect, thank you. Yeah, and so Housing Justice Center, where, actually I'll wait for the blurb coming up soon.
You should be good to go.
Perfect, thank you. Okay, and can everybody see my PowerPoint okay?
Yes.
All right, perfect. So Housing Justice Center, we're a nonprofit in St. Paul, where we do public interest advocacy, legal organization. We also are helping people with RentHelpMN in addition to the stuff in the blurb. And the way that we're connected to RentHelpMN is that we're a field partner with Minnesota Housing. So we're not connected with Minnesota Housing in terms of, we're not a part of the government agency, but we're a field partner with them. So we don't have any special access to people's applications. However, we meet with Minnesota Housing usually at least three times a week. We can bring individual questions. We can also email them directly and ask help anybody if they're having issues with their application or they're just kind of wondering what's going on with their application. We are also able to help people if they're having trouble getting an application started, or if they just want help in general, kind of navigating the process. So yeah, feel free to contact us at that number. We also take emails at that. Just if you have any general questions about RentHelpMN or any housing issues, at that email. And then specifically, if you've been denied RentHelpMN, that's so as a field partner, we can help with a bunch of things, but specifically we would specialize somewhat in people who have been denied and need help doing RentHelpMN appeals. And so we help in two ways. First of all, if it's kind of an issue where we think it's something really technical and they shouldn't have been denied, or they're having an issue that way, we can contact Minnesota Housing and see if they'll reopen it themselves. Otherwise, we're happy to help people do the appeals process, which I'll talk about a little bit more later. That's when you're denied and you can notify Minnesota Housing that you want to appeal that decision because you think it's wrong. We're happy to help with that as well. And that's our specific number for RentHelpMN appeals. Right. So as Larry and Ben mentioned, we're going to talk about RentHelpMN, which is the state's COVID-19 emergency rental assistance program. And so that's federal funds that have been set aside to help renters. And the RentHelpMN program is the way that Minnesota Housing, through that's the way that they're going to distribute the funds to renters. So the eligibility is the three things that are on the slide. So first of all, you have to be, and I'll explain them a little bit more, but just as a broad overview, you first of all have to be a low income Minnesota renter. And as Larry's mentioned, there's specific kind of income guidelines for that. The second one is you have to either be eligible for unemployment benefits, or, so you don't have to have both, but you have to either be eligible for unemployment benefits or have experienced financial hardship directly or indirectly due to the coronavirus outbreak. And the third one is that you have to demonstrate a risk of experiencing homelessness or housing instability. And so those are pretty broad, and we'll break those down a little bit further. So what is low income for RentHelpMN? Well, renters have to be at or below 80% of the area median income. And that's divided up by county. I put Ramsey County's AMI, area median income, on the screen. As you can see, it starts at 55,000, but the more people that you have in your household, the higher it goes. So 2-person household, 3-person household, 4-person household, all the way up into an 8-person household. Though there's an increasing amount of income that would, you would still be qualified for the program. And there's obviously a difference if you're in Ramsey County or Hennepin County versus if you're in a county in greater Minnesota. The AMI in those is going to be a lot lower. So if you are, or you're assisting somebody who lives out there, their income guidelines are going to be a lot different than somebody who lives in Ramsey or Hennepin, for instance, which the AMI is going to be higher for those folks. There's a complete list on the RentHelpMN website that goes county by county and from 1-person to 8-person households, and you can view that on the website over there. You can self attest to, so documentation required for income certification. Well, first of all, in order to make sure that you're at or below 80% of area median income, Minnesota Housing is going to ask you for a few things. And so the first one is a form of ID for the head of household, or if you know you're by yourself, just your ID. And then you also have to document that you rent. And that documentation is pretty loose, and the form of IDs are pretty broad as well. Those are on the website as well. But the documentation that you rent, all you have to do is have a copy of your lease or some sort of paper indication that you are that you don't own the place that you live in, essentially. And that can encompass a lot of different housing that I'll cover in a slide or two. And then for household income, you'll need to document the household income for all the adults that live in the household. And the most common ways would be through a tax, so your tax forms from last year. You could also use a pay stub, or you could have your employer certify that you make a certain amount of money. If you exhaust kind of all of the different, and again, there's more, I kind of wanted to keep it concise for the slide. And there's on the website, there's going to be like more ways to certify your income, but where you exhaust all of that, in limited circumstances, you can self-certify. You can just say that, this is the income that I make, I'm attesting to this is how much I make. And of course, you can always try that. They might, reject your application and ask you later or ask you for more income documentation later on. But if you really don't have any of the documents for household income that they're asking for, self-certification is available. So wouldn't want that to be a barrier for anybody applying for RentHelpMN. Okay, and again, like I was mentioning, the types of rental properties that are eligible for assistance is pretty broad. So not only does it cover apartments, it covers single family homes, it covers rented manufacturer homes. One thing to note is that it'll cover your hotel or motel stay. so long as it's your primary residence. And then this is the broad catch-all. So that this is where, like, if you're renting, but you're not exactly sure, you just know that I don't own this place and I'm paying somebody rent. Other informal lease agreements, they're going to be reviewed by the program. So again, if you have something kind of unconventional, but you're for sure living there and you don't own it, it's worth trying to apply if you need the rental assistance, because again, that's a broad catch-all. And a lot of things could hypothetically be encompassed by that. And it's going to be up to the program whether they decide. But again, wouldn't want that to be a barrier for people at least trying to get rental assistance if they need it. Okay, and then breaking it down a little bit further, what exactly is covered by RentHelpMN? So RentHelpMN covers assistance for up to 12 months of back rent past kind of, I think March or April of 2020. So again, it has to be COVID-19 related, but up to 12 months of back rent. And so you could do that without asking for anything else. But if you have back rent, you may also be eligible for RentHelpMN to cover your utility costs. So they say utility costs, so that's electric, heat, gas, but not including phone or internet, which the program won't cover. You could also ask for up to 3 months of forward rent in addition to any back rent that you might owe. So again, you might owe back rent, and then when you apply, you can also ask for 3 months of forward rent at the time of your application. And one thing I just wanted to mention really quickly is that late fees are covered as well. So you can add in your late fees. The landlord's going to have to itemize that and separate that out from your rent and verify that this is how much they owe in late fees, this is how much they owe in rent. There's kind of a certification with that, but in short, late fees are covered as well. So you can include that in what you want RentHelpMN to cover. All right, and a couple of caveats that I want to add for right now, because there's some confusion, and this is really understandable confusion because the rent help marketing doesn't not marketing, but the rent help materials don't necessarily make this 100% clear. Right now, we wouldn't advise anybody to apply if they're only requesting forward rent or they're only requesting help with utilities. Okay. So to explain this really quickly, I mean, that's the kind of important bit, but to further explain that, right now, RentHelpMN, they've kind of determined that they're going to have 2 different phases. So in phase 1, that's going to be for people with back rent and other costs. Phase 2 is going to be for people that are only requesting forward rent or only requesting utilities. Now, phase 2, that's very TBD. Right now, we're very firmly in phase 1, and the plan is for, at least for the near future, to be in phase 1 for a while. So right now, the only assistance, they're rejecting applications that are only requesting forward rent or only requesting utilities or only requesting forward rent and utilities. So the rule of thumb is that you would need to have back rent. You need to claim back rent in addition to any forward rent and any utilities, even though the program covers all 3 of those categories. Yeah, for those that don't owe back rent, but could use help with utilities or forward rent, keep your ear out for that. But again, we haven't heard anything about when that's going to happen. It's very TBD right now. Yeah. All right. And I see a question here, and in addition, like when I'm going through these slides, please feel free to either raise your hand or unmute and ask. I'm happy to, there's gonna be time for questions at the end. There's like a big space for Q&A, but I'm happy to answer some now. So Janelle, and I hope I'm saying that right, please go ahead.
Yes, I was gonna say something about that, the not asking about money for
Forward and utilities.
more in utilities, but see what if you in the moratorium you could pay your rent, but you couldn't pay your utilities, and so you just got to know, because everything is being lifted and telling you you're gonna be out and sitting in the dark, And I don't see that. I mean, I know y'all going by y'all phase 1, phase 2, but
Mhm.
I don't think that is right because there's a lot of people just paying money. I mean, paying rent just got Social Security. I get Social Security, so I just pay my rent,
Yeah,
and
and
that's all I got enough for.
yeah, no, and we agree. Housing Justice Center, we're not Minnesota Housing. Again, we're a field partner with Minnesota Housing. We're helping people navigate the program. But Minnesota Housing sets the priorities, and at their perspective, it's kind of like a line, and they're kind of going through their priorities. And their priorities, first of all, is to keep people in the home for back rent. So their view is that we want to make sure we take care of everybody with back rent first, because those are people who in kind of the way that they're kind of organizing it, are deemed
But
most at
can they?
risk.
But can they throw? But the landlord, okay, they got that rule out there that man just was explaining about what they could kick people out for. Okay, if you don't have no lights and electricity running, can they kick you out in there now?
Well, right now I'm not, because I'm not exactly sure about the utility shut off. I would have to look at it a little bit more. I think I don't know, maybe Larry, if you know the specifics of the utilities, I think it's like August that they can't, right? Until for utilities.
Yeah, I'll have to take a look at that. I think
Yeah.
you're right about that. But so you've got two things on with utilities. One, you've got the utility company and what can they do? And then you also have the relationship with the landlord. And so like if the landlord were trying to evict a tenant for not paying a utility bill, then the question would be whether that is a material violation of the lease. So that's kind of where the framework would be in terms of deciding for a judge to decide whether that that act of a tenant was a material lease violation. I think that if it didn't present damage issues and the utility company is still providing the service, that it probably wouldn't be a material violation.
But if you have kids in your household, that would be child protection and everything else coming after you.
Yeah.
So what do you do? Just sit outside until you get your stuff paid out?
Well, so Janelle, I and I totally hear you, and I'm with you on that. I don't, that people who need, that there are people who need forward rent and utilities as well, and those are people who don't have back rent, but certainly have great needs and certainly are at a risk of homelessness, and certainly need state help to keep up with those bills. I guess for the purposes of rent help right now, just for the utilities only application, just unfortunately they are rejecting them all right now, as far as we can tell. So just trying to prevent people who might only have utilities from applying for right now, because their applications will get rejected. In terms of assistance with, Linda did put in a couple of things put into something about a voucher. You could also apply for county emergency assistance, which is another resource there. And then finally, a lot of utilities will work with tenants on a payment plan. And so if it's simple, if there is an amount of income that you have, but it's not enough to meet your current utility bill, it's good to reach out to the utility company as well and see if you can work out a payment plan, which is often a lot lower than your normal utility bill. But again, just for the purposes of the rent help program, yeah, just unfortunately, they're really not doing anything about just utilities for now. And the hope is that at some point in the future they will. But just
a couple
at this
things
current
I just
moment,
add right now for folks that are having specific problems. First of all, if you're having problems with rent help, the Housing Justice Center is like the place to contact. If you're having problems with your landlord or with your voucher, I would say contact your local legal aid office in St. Paul, Ramsey County at Smurls. And they could kind of help you work through that. Also, Homeline is a really good advice service that's out there. So there are resources out there to help folks navigate things. And then, of course, as I said at the end of my thing, if you have concerns or criticisms of how this stuff is running, contact your state representative, contact the governor, and have your voice heard.
Absolutely, because again, it's something piggybacking off of Larry said, it's really important that legislators and people in government are really aware that this is an issue, because I think they know that the program exists, but some of these other issues, like I'm somebody who needs forward rent like right now, or I'm somebody who needs utilities right now, that's not necessarily something on their radars. So this is somewhere where advocacy can really help illuminate that issue. Right. Well, thank you so much, Janelle. And if there's no other questions for right now, I'll just keep going through my slides really quick. Okay. All right. So right now, all right. So there are 2 ways to apply. And so the first one is applying online through RentHelpMN.org. So you can apply online. It's a big link, and then there's a bunch of forms you'll kind of go through. You'll submit documentation. One thing about the documentation that I want to highlight is you don't necessarily have to scan it in. They'll take smartphone photos for now. So if that's a barrier to access, you don't necessarily have to have somebody scan it in and upload it that way. You can just kind of take a photo and upload the photo to your computer. For folks that have issues in terms of technology access, you can also apply by paper, via mail, or fax. The only thing about applying by paper, via mail, or fax is a lot of times the correspondence from RentHelp has been online. So I would say, like, if people are able and have access to the internet or a computer or a smartphone, the preference would be to apply online for now. But certainly there's a paper option available if there's somebody who needs that one. And you can include, if you're doing it by mail or fax, there's a cover letter online. If you have any issues, if you need help, you can contact us with that. But I just wanted to highlight, if you're doing it on your own, it's pretty straightforward, but there is a lot of documentation required, as highlighted below. But just to make sure to include a cover letter, a cover page, if you're going to do it by mail or by fax. Okay, so I have this big old slide for the end of the eviction moratorium and how it affects RentHelpMN. And so I won't go through it too much, because Larry's already gone through quite a bit of this in really great detail, and really gone through the specifics and the good nitty gritty of what you need to know. I'll just talk about it in kind of how it relates to RentHelpMN. And so Larry's kind of covered our June 30th, 2021 date. Again, landlords can give lease terminations or non-renewal notices, and then July 14th, it switches to evictions only for material violations of leases. And Larry's talked about, what a material violation of leases, and I guess material violations of leases and kind of the other things that Larry was listing out. But again, the important part is that excludes non-payment of rent. So non-payment of rent is still not a reason to evict somebody until August 13th. So again, August 13th, it turns into people who are not eligible for COVID-19 rental assistance. And I just wanted to highlight and mention again something that Larry said. Again, the criteria is people who are not eligible for COVID-19 rental assistance, and putting on kind of the legal hat of that. Well, what does not eligible mean right now when we don't have any cases exactly explaining what that's going to look like? Well, right now, the interpretation that could be made, and also is something that Minnesota Housing said is the way that they're kind of interpreting right now, is that the fact that you're not eligible, you also have to affirmatively say that you don't want COVID-19 rental assistance. And that covers kind of the June 30th. Also, you can see there's also, you can be evicted if you refuse to apply or comply with the application process. But basically that non-eligibility, if you are eligible, I should say. I mean, if your income is way over the AMI, for instance, you definitely wouldn't fall in that category regardless of what you do. But say you're somebody who's eligible for COVID-19 rental assistance, but you simply, you're still waiting for the disbursement. You say you applied in May and, you're still waiting because the system has taken a while, or say, you just haven't gotten around to it yet. In terms of the COVID-19 rental assistance, the interpretation right now, and again, this hasn't been tested in a court yet, is that you would have to do something affirmative. You have to do something that really indicates to your landlord, I don't want this rental assistance. I don't even want to apply for it. So, but from August 13th and August 12th, those 2 dates, those are only evictions and terminations for people who are not eligible at all for the COVID-19 rental assistance. And in terms of RentHelpMN, that would, of course, be people who are over the 80% area median income. But then October 12th, as Larry mentioned, that's when things really, really open up. That's when all lease terminations or evictions are allowed, except for people who have pending COVID-19 rental assistance applications, one of which is RentHelpMN. And that's why, as much as we can encourage people to apply for RentHelpMN or another rental assistance application, it's really important if you or somebody who is eligible to get an application in, because there are additional protections after October 12th, so long as you have a pending COVID-19 rental assistance application in. So again, it's really important to apply to get those additional protections. And those protections go all the way from October 12th into June of the next year, June 1st, 2022, at which point that's going to be the end of all COVID-19 renter protections. Okay, as I mentioned earlier, there is an option to appeal. If you're denied, and so that's option number 1. So appeal can take 2 forms. Right now, there's no way to do an appeal online. You have to do it by mail or by fax. In the RentHelpMN website, I believe under Learn More or Resources, about halfway down, there's a big PDF. There's a little subheading that says appeals. And then there's like a little PDF that says, how do I, you can click on, and it has a page-long explanation of an appeal. I'll go over some of the basics right now. When you appeal, it has to be by mail or by fax. Either is fine. One issue that's come up is sometimes the fax number will be busy. But I think we've had a couple of people try it by fax and it's gone through. If it's busy, try again later or do it by mail. It has to be done within 10 days from when you were denied or when your application was denied. So it has to be done in order to preserve your right to appeal. You have to do it within 10 days from that date. There's no specific form that you need. Most of the time, a letter will do. And in the letter, you just want to say who you are, have easy ways to identify what your application is. So your name, your address, and if you happen to know your application ID number, put it in, but if you don't, that's okay. Why you're denied if known, why your denial was an error, and why you should be eligible if that's different from why you were denied. And that can all just take a form of to whom it may concern. You just write all that stuff in the body, and then you say best regards or thank you, or and then you sign off from there. All right. Option number 2 would be reapplying. And this would be something that specifically would be good for people who are denied because they only applied for forward rent or they only applied for utilities. And while they're waiting for their application, they accrued or they got back rent while they're waiting for their application. And now they're eligible because they have both back rent and they have forward rent, but they're not able to apply again yet because they already have an application to the system. Well, this feature just came out today. You could hit a reapply button, in which case, you would just fill out your information again. It would show that you're eligible and you should get your application processed that way. Again, it just came out today, so we're still figuring out the details, kind of the very specific details about it. But generally, that's the gist right now. So if, in addition, just want to add, if you know somebody who's been denied and they should have been eligible, or they're eligible now, you can also encourage them to go back into the application and see if there's a reapply button there as well. Okay, we'll go over some quick FAQs before we go kind of into a general question session. So first of all, does my landlord have to participate in the RentHelpMN process? And no, landlord non-participation might slow down the application because because Minnesota Housing does check in with the landlord to make sure that they're not participating. But if the landlord affirmatively says that they're not going to participate, the money, which normally goes to the landlord directly, will go instead directly to the tenant, who can then use it to pay for the back rent that way. But instead of going to the landlord the money is just going to get paid directly to the tenant, kind of going around the landlord. So if you have people who are worried about their landlord, you know, preventing them from getting rental assistance, again, landlord non-participation is okay. Okay, and this is something that Larry mentioned a little bit, but wanted to say again.
Would you be happy if she did that to you or your stuff?
Is, you know, what if I've moved since I put in my rent help application, or what if I plan to move, you know, after you submit your rent help application, what if I plan to move? Right now at this time, if you have moved since you put in your application, or if you move before your application is fully processed and you get the rental funds, they're going to spit your application back out as ineligible. Because again, the program is supposed to keep people in their kind of current abode or their current living situation. And if that person's moved or they move before they get the money, then the application becomes ineligible, is the way that it's gone so far. Okay. Bridget, I think has, if you want to do the last two FAQs.
Yep, and we'll keep this brief so we can open it up to questions for you all as well. But we did want to highlight some other frequently asked questions that we've heard from folks. And the first is, how do I check the status of my application? This is something that we're encouraging people to check their portal frequently. So once you hit submit, if you have the capacity, check that portal regularly just to see if your status has been updated or if you've received any communications about additional items that might be needed to complete your application. If you don't have regular access to a computer or internet, you can call 211 and someone should be able to help you figure out the status of your application through 211. And then secondly, this is just to reemphasize a point that both Larry and Max, I think, had mentioned at one point, is that if you don't owe rent right now, but you're worried about future rent, unfortunately, we still are in phase 1 of the RentHelpMN program. So you do need to owe rent in order to be eligible to apply for assistance right now. So we have acknowledged in what Max had mentioned a few minutes ago, that when RentHelpMN moves to phase 2 at a future to be determined date, that's when you can apply for forward rent without having already owed back rent. So we did just want to emphasize right now that if you are submitting an application at this time, you do need to owe back rent in order to be eligible. But we did want to go ahead and make sure that we covered some of those frequent questions that we've heard from folks kind of in the field as a field partner before opening it up for more general questions. But I'll pass it back off to Max to close up.
Hey, thanks, Bridget. And yeah, so again, here's our phone number. There's our general number, our 612 number. There's our email. And again, if there's a specific RentHelpMN appeal question, you can call that number. But honestly, if it's just a rent help question, you can just call that number as well. It doesn't necessarily have to be an appeal. We're happy to take questions on either. All right. And I think right now we have some time for general questions for either Larry or Bridget and I.
So I'll start off with a question. So something I was thinking about is what happens, and maybe you answered this already, but what happens if a landlord doesn't complete their side of the paperwork in the process here?
Yeah, so if a landlord doesn't participate, you know, Minnesota Housing is going to reach out to them. So they're going to try to, you know, contact the landlord and, you know, kind of inform them what's going to happen with the you know, rent help program. You know, inform the landlord if you don't participate, the money is going to go directly to the tenant. You know, Minnesota Housing is a little bit hesitant to do it without the landlord, you know, because because there's kind of a preference, I think, to go through the landlord. But yeah, at a certain point, they will assume that the landlord does not want to participate or is non-communicative and move on to just getting all the information from the tenant, and the money will go straight to the tenant.
I see a couple of questions here. Cheryl asked, is the rent help available for undocumented people? And Linda, I saw that you answered, but I think, you know, is the process different? Are there any restrictions? Could you just talk about that for a moment?
Right, and I checked on the undocumented issue thing, and I think right now, according to one of the FAQs, they're not asking for citizenship status. You know, I would check the FAQ one more time, but it shouldn't matter based on what they that says over there. And sorry, what was the second question again, Ben?
Just that if you were lacking documentation, if there was any additional steps you might need to take.
Yeah, so if you're lacking documentation, they're saying in limited circumstances, self-certification of your income is available. And so in which case, you know, if you could explain why this document, or, you know, if you submit it without income information, they'll most likely ask you for it. But if you have extenuating circumstances, self-certification is available. Both RentHelpMN's information says that, but also federal guidance says that self-certification of income should be available for people.
Linda, I see your question in the chat, but you also turned your video on. Do you want to ask that, or should I ask?
Which one?
Just about the most recent one. So if someone, oh, I see you have two there. I was referring to the one if someone was at a hotel.
So long as it was
Yeah,
their
if they were encamped and they got money to stay 4 nights or 5 nights, and that was their only place they lived, and all their belongings were with them, and that's where they slept every night, and that was then their home. Could they apply for that help to be paid for and also get a new apartment with deposit, truck, movers?
They most likely would not be able to get the
app fee, crim check.
So they would most
I
likely.
think it's so,
sorry,
sorry.
Linda.
I just think it's
No,
so
I'm sorry.
ridiculous. They're not using the money. They have bucket loads of money and they're not using it to transition people out of camps. It's just, I'm astonished.
Yeah, I will first acknowledge, yes, for the latter portion. There is a lot of money, and hasn't been all. Only a fraction of it has been distributed yet. To answer the encampment question, so for the hotel, that's possible. You know, if they could show that that's their permanent residence for now, and that they owe the hotel X amount of dollars for the room. You know, that again, hotel rooms are specifically hotel and motel rooms are specifically put in the guidelines as a type of abode that somebody could apply to RentHelpMN for. However, as for the new apartment part, that kind of goes into that big move out bucket. And so unfortunately, they wouldn't be able to ask for moving fees, you know, movers, etc., deposit on the next place. You know, understanding that's, again, you know, we're using this money to prevent homelessness. That's all things that prevent homelessness. But unfortunately, the program's not paying for those type of fees.
That would be a place where county emergency assistance might be helpful, because see, part of the reason for having this program, and all of us, you know, Bridget and Max and I have our problems with aspects of the program. But part of what the program was there for is traditionally emergency assistance wouldn't be helping out in a situation like this, because they'd look at, okay, you know, a year's worth of rent, it's going to be a lot cheaper for us to give you some money, help you get into a shelter, or pay a deposit on a new place. So a lot of times emergency assistance wasn't keeping someone at the old place, they were kind of shepherding them to the new place. And what this program is at least intended to do, whether it does it all the time or not, is to kind of have that money there to help the person stay where they are. So for the person who's in an encampment, I don't know that it helps a lot to kind of get into a place that you can't afford and then say, help me Rent Help Minnesota to pay that thing, as opposed to using emergency assistance to help get into a place that is maybe potentially affordable looking forward.
Yeah, there's nothing affordable for people.
Sorry, and Bridget just grabbed something that was helpful off of the Q&A. So Bridget, if you want to go ahead really quick.
Yes, so on the Q&A from the RentHelpMN website, they do share that if you are homeless, can you receive assistance as a question? And they do direct folks to phase 2, but they also just making sure that, you know, with the phase 2 program, RentHelpMN might be able to pay 3 months of upcoming rent if someone experiencing homelessness enters into a new rental lease. But they do direct folks to 211 as well for that situation. So if folks are in that situation, call 211 for help, and they may be able to direct to the best form of assistance as well.
Yeah, but again, we're really in phase one right now, so probably not. And for the reasons that Larry kind of, maybe not for the hotel room either, but again, hotel rooms are listed, so it's possible if an application gets in.
Is there any sense of when phase 2 might begin?
No, not yet. And they really have to, there's a backlog for phase 1, so they would really have to work through that backlog, I think a lot further. But again, that would be me opining. From Minnesota Housing right now, no, nothing yet about phase 2. Yeah, I can answer also one other question about Linda. One other question that you asked, Linda, about if you apply and get evicted, can the money go to you for your next unit you move to from the eviction site? Larry touched on this a little bit, and fortunately, no. Right now, if you get evicted, the money will go to neither you or your landlord. Again, Larry pointed out that that's a really good incentive for landlords to keep people in their building. And maybe if you're a tenant or a tenant in that situation, you might want to have the tenant remind the landlord about that. But unfortunately, right now, if they're evicted, they're no longer housed there and they would no longer get the rent assistance.
And anyone who's looking at a potential eviction right now, they should definitely reach out to, I'm just assuming everyone here is probably more Ramsey County connected here, but that would be Southern Minnesota Regional Legal Services, or SMERLS, or Volunteer Lawyers Network. The mediation programs are good as well, but sometimes it's good to kind of get that legal advice first before you engage in mediation, so that mediators can't really get on one side or the other. They can stay in the middle. And so they can't kind of like, if they see a power imbalance, they can't necessarily say, well, we're going to help this person more than that person. So they kind of have to stay in the middle. But mediation programs are really good about kind of saying to the landlord, sure, this is what you want to do here, because if you go ahead with this, you're going to lose a whole bunch of money. So have you thought about that? But going into a mediation session, it's really helpful for the tenant to be talking, and both the landlord as well, to be talking to an attorney and say, landlord, these are some holes in your case, or tenant, these are some holes in your defense. And a lot of times the reason people kind of reach settlements is because neither one of them has a perfect case, right? I mean, if both sides have holes in their cases, neither one of them has certainty that they're going to win their case. And that's when it makes a lot of sense for people to find something in the middle, so that they get the certainty of an outcome that's better than a loss.
And to piggyback on what Larry said, if somebody has an eviction filed on them, absolutely contact a legal aid. And for St. Paul, Beach Pearls. But if there's something filed, yeah, for sure. Okay, and I think I saw one more question about, I think from Krista. Oh, here it is. And I'm not exact. So this is the Eastside Freedom Library has been hosting listening sessions with City Council to determine how city dollars should be spent through the American Rescue Plan Act funding. Could these utility and housing transition costs qualify for this funding? And I'm not quite familiar with that funding right now. With that. So unfortunately, I wouldn't be able to speak on that personally. I don't know if Larry would be able to, but
I could talk about that for a moment, just because.
Okay, thanks, Ben.
In communication with that. So from my understanding, it can be used for folks who are experiencing any type of issue related to COVID. And so it seems like American Rescue Plan Act dollars can go into bridging those kind of gaps. What's going on with that right now is that the mayor of St. Paul has been meeting with department heads and has started to talk to city council members about that. And that's why we started hosting our own town halls to make sure that the priorities of community members within the city of St. Paul are voiced to the city council. So they haven't made a decision about that money just yet. And so that now is the time to talk to your city council member, to talk to the mayor, to talk to any local elected official about your priorities for that money, because it is pretty broad in scope what it can be used for, as long as it's related to inequities that have become more apparent because of COVID-19 or directly related to COVID. I hope that answers the question.
Then I would add that if people want to voice their opinions about how the money should be used. We will be having another listening session on Thursday, July 22nd at 5 in person in the parking lot at Arlington Hills Lutheran Church. Ben will be humping 50 chairs so that people can sit down and voice their opinions. So join us the 22nd of July at 5 and see if we can't have some democracy about how these decisions are going to be made.
And Arlington Hills Lutheran Church is right next to the East Side Freedom Library, in case you didn't know.
Well,
Go ahead, Linda.
yeah, I was there at your session last week. They were talking about new libraries and fountains after they first went to Wi-Fi for universal Wi-Fi and getting the lead out of the water. And that went quickly to fountains and libraries when there are people encamped. And the city staff person said, it's really complicated and it's going to be really too hard to explain it to the people, how much leniency there is for the American Rescue Plan funding. And unless people stand up and say, no, it goes to people first who are impacted by COVID for the foreseeable future, for the longest number of years to come, who are already in harm. And COVID brought them further into harm's way, and they've lost family members, they had to pay for funerals, et cetera. You know, come on. I mean, we got to get these people awake who want fountains and libraries. This is not what it's for.
Janelle, I see you have your hand raised as well.
I'm just gonna say is that I am a person that between Minneapolis and St. Paul. I work with Minneapolis and St. Paul to try to help both of them, because it seems like people that's homeless keep running to St. Paul, then they run back to Minneapolis, then they keep running back and forth. And this situation that we're talking about tonight, I just feel like it's going to be making more homeless people. I ran into a lady in the store that's got some things that's going on with nursing and stuff, and somebody was saying, "Won't you do something? Won't you plan for it now?" And she said, "It's no housing. It's no housing. It's none at all." So when people are making these programs for housing or doing these housing things, they're not setting them right. You be using this, I mean, well, the state is using this money and playing with people's lives. And when you talk about the hotel, we had to move people to hotels, and most of the sanctuary moment people was out there paying out of their pockets, but they didn't have enough money to pay out their pockets, because these were people like you and me and everybody else that's on here helping them pay for this stuff, asking people on Facebook, asking people over here for money to help these people. That's what it's going to continue doing, is we're going to continue helping and asking people for money, and people are going to wonder why don't the state help? Why won't the state help? The state is doing what they want to do, how they want it. Phase 1, phase 2, whatever phase it is, whatever way they think is right to put the money in. Because I'm just saying, like, when I mentioned child protection on here, I'm not playing. I got in trouble with child protection a lot in St. Paul. A lot. Because I wanted to go to work and I wanted to go to school. It wasn't like I want to go party or whatever. It's I wanted to go to work and go to school. I couldn't do that because I had kids and they didn't want me to do it. And then you're going to see people say that, people want to smoke, people want to get drunk, people want to do this, people want to do that. No, they don't want to do that, but it looks like that's the only thing they can do. Because that's the only thing that you will let them do, is do that and be happy with it. People want to do more with their lives. I'm sorry. There you go, Ben.
Thanks, Janelle. Does anyone have any other questions? We've got about 9 minutes left. I have a couple of others that I had, but I just want to make sure that everyone has a chance to ask these wonderful folks who have spent their part of their evening with us. Okay, I'm going to jump into another question then. So something I had heard was that for folks that are applying for the Rent Help Minnesota, that there's a as you mentioned, Max, there's a backlog. Do you know how long the waiting period is right now, and what folks can do while they're kind of just waiting?
Yeah, so right now there's definitely a backlog. People who were applying in April, we're kind of hearing back at the end of, waiting all the way till the end of June to hear back. Right now it seems like people, anecdotally, it seems like people who applied around May-ish are starting to hear back now. But again, we've had people who applied in April, people who applied in May, who are still waiting to hear back. There's not a lot of clarity for why, some people's, applications are getting processed faster. Some people's taking longer, assuming it's, if they have to reach out to the landlord or if they have to reach out to a tenant again, et cetera, it might take longer or shorter. But that's kind of generally, it's been, if you applied in June, you're probably not going to hear back for a while, unfortunately. But again, Mr. Housing said they've hired a bunch of people. It could speed up really quickly. And, they are trying to get through them as fast as possible. But again, to give you an idea of kind of how long people are waiting, that's been kind of the expectation so far. The thing is, though, they've also been really clear that the money is still there. So if people are anxious about that, the assurance right now is that for people who are in the phase 1, so that's back rent plus, that money is going to be available and is going to be, if they're eligible and the applications are processed, those should get paid out. So the money should come to those people if they're in that situation. In terms of what you can do now, right now, if you can see your online application, you can see a status. It's anxiety inducing, I'm sure, and can be frustrating to see that it hasn't changed. But again, just keeping track, checking in pretty often to make sure that the status hasn't changed, specifically that it hasn't changed to a denial, so that you can get the appeal in within the 10 days, or if there's a documentation request, to make sure that you're responding to that as soon as possible. You can also contact 211 and to see if they have any information. If the first person is unable to tell you anything about your application, sometimes calling in a second or a third time helps to get a different person and maybe get somebody or maybe the application has changed between calls. But beyond that, yeah, waiting for now has been so far the way, and it has been taking a while.
Thanks, Max. So another question I had for all of you was, do tenants have to pay this money back in any form? Maybe you touched
No.
on it, but no, just no.
No. The only issue, and this was a question I think Linda might have asked. So one thing is, when you apply, you do attest to that you're not applying for any other rental assistance program. The biggest issue is if you get double paid. So you apply to multiple places, or your landlord applied through Zero Balance, which is another program that we're not talking about today, because that's that's more landlord driven. The landlords are the ones that are applying for that, and that zeroes out somebody's balance. But say, for instance, you have your balance zeroed out by Zero Balance, which is another state program, and you receive RentHelpMN. In that case, that would be as people who are familiar with the kind of public benefits world, that gets into closer to a misrepresentation or fraud. There's certainly defenses for that, especially if you just kind of did your thing and for whatever reason, and you weren't trying to do misrepresentation or fraud. But the only issue comes with a double payment. That's the only situation where you could run into penalties or need to pay back. But in terms of that initial payment, it's not a loan, it's a relief grant.
Thank you so much, Max. Are there any final questions before I just go through a couple of announcements? Just wait a moment.
And I see Janelle's hand is up. Is that from before, or would you?
I think that's up from before.
That might be from before. That's okay. Yeah, and happy to take any other questions now, or again, we're available by email or phone as well.
Oh, Joseph just asked, if people are getting subsidized housing, do they qualify?
I believe yes, for the portion that they're not subsidized for. Rich. And Rich is I believe you're a field partner also as well.
Yeah, I am. I'm actually driving. I
Oh,
appreciate
yeah.
it. I didn't think you'd call on me that quick. I do apologize that I'm in motion. I just want to say, man, you did a really good job presenting, and the help is there, the money's there, and you did a really good job of just letting people know to try to be patient, because it is stressful. Being on the field and helping people, you hear it every day. It's you live it, you breathe it, and it's tough. So yeah, just really good job, Max, letting folks know that the money's there, and then if they apply and be patient and have that landlord work with them, they will be all right. But it's very important that that landlord lets people stay put, because the moment you leave, you lose out. And right now, landlords are looking at that as an option, because we know even if someone applies, even if they put in that money for that UD, even if they don't get it, the UD still there on the residence record. And landlords are well aware of that, so they're almost willing to take that loss just to get rid of people, right? So, yeah, I just really wanted to say good job. And yes, I'm a field partner. And Ben, man, I hope you end up emailing me back, man, because there are other programs out here from Ramsey County residents that they need to know about. But Max, good job. Thank you, man. I appreciate your time.
No, and thank you so much for your advocacy during our field partner meetings, and everything that you do as well.
Richard,
I don't mind being a pain in the butt, man. They don't have to like me, you know what I mean? They just have to respect the residents of Lansing and the county. So that's,
No, you're absolutely great.
Thank you, man.
No, thank you. Thank you.
Okay, so I just have a couple of announcements. Richard, I saw your email. It got lost in my thread. I'm so sorry, but yes, I'm looking into that too. So upcoming announcements. So next week, just next to the Eastside Freedom Library on July 22nd, we are going to be hosting another discussion on the American Rescue Plan Act and the St. Paul City budget. Come, make your voice heard. It's an in-person meeting. We know at least City Council members Prince and Yang will be there, and potentially Council President Bren Moen as well. In the beginning of August, we are hosting a huge national night out event on August 3rd from 5 to 8 p.m. And we're going to have music, and we're going to have some actors come out. Maybe Circus Juventus is going to be there as well. There's going to be food. So come out to that. It's just going to be outside the Eastside Freedom Library. Larry, Max, and Bridget, and Meg, I know you're sharing some resources there too. Thank you so much for coming out tonight and sharing this information. You're going to be able to access it on YouTube and Facebook afterwards. So just thank you so much, everyone, for coming out tonight. And I hope to see you at the next couple of events that we have.
We'll be sending that YouTube video to your FBI files too.
No, and
We want the government to know what good work you're all doing.
Thanks. And Ben, if it's okay, I can make the PowerPoint available to you, and you're free to distribute that as well.
That would be great. I'll share out everything. I believe I have everyone's emails from today. So thanks, Max. And thank you, Larry.
Thanks, Ben. How about some love for Ben? He put it together.
Thank you, Ben, and thank you so much for having us.
And Ben, I want to know if I still have I still have a seat out there on the 3rd of the night.
Absolutely. Okay.
Thank you for the information, everyone. Good night.
Good night, everyone.
Thank you.